Hi, I'm Natalie Harper. 3 weeks ago, I walked into my cousin's wedding reception wearing my grandmother's vintage emerald dress. My own Aunt Patricia looked me up and down and announced loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, "Security, please escort this uninvited guest out immediately." The humiliation burned like acid as 200 pairs of eyes turned to watch me being removed from my own family gathering. What they didn't know was that I held the legal rights to every single grape variety that built their million-dollar vineyard empire. And by the time I walked out those mahogany doors, I'd already made the call that would change everything. But the real victory wasn't destroying their business. It was finally understanding my own worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ever been made to feel invisible by the people who should love you most, only to discover you held all the cards the entire time? Stay with me, because what happened next exposed 20 years of lies and made my aunt beg on her knees in front of the same crowd that watched me leave in shame. The October air in Asheville carried that crisp mountain bite that makes your cheeks flush and your breath visible in tiny clouds. I stood outside the wrought iron gates of Biltmore Estate, smoothing down the silk fabric of my grandmother's dress one last time. The emerald green caught the late afternoon sunlight, and for a moment I felt her presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. Dorothy Whitman had worn this dress to her own wedding 60 years ago, back when she was just a farmhand's daughter with dirt under her fingernails and revolution in her heart. The invitation in my purse felt heavier than it should have. Ivory cardstock with gold embossing, the kind that screams old money and careful breeding. Victoria Caldwell cordially invites you to celebrate her union with Marcus Reed. At the bottom, in smaller print, cocktail attire suggested. Not that anyone had actually suggested I attend. The invitation had arrived 3 days before the wedding, clearly an afterthought. Probably because someone realized how it would look if Dorothy Whitman's granddaughter wasn't there. I walked through those gates knowing I didn't belong, but also knowing I had every right to be there. My burgundy heels clicked against the stone pathway as I made my way toward the gardens, where the ceremony had just concluded. The sound of laughter and clinking champagne glasses drifted through the evening air, mixing with the distant melody of a string quartet. Everything about this place whispered wealth and privilege, from the perfectly manicured hedges to the way the staff moved with practiced invisibility. The reception was being held in the estate's conservatory, a breathtaking glass structure that seemed to capture and magnify the golden hour light. As I approached the entrance, I could see Victoria through the windows, radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown, surrounded by a cloud of bridesmaids in dusty rose silk. Her laughter carried that particular quality of someone who had never known real worry, never wondered if she belonged anywhere. I paused at the threshold, watching my cousin hold court in the center of the room. We used to be close once, back when we were children spending summers at Grandmother Dot's farm in Hendersonville. Victoria would follow me through the greenhouses, wide-eyed as I explained which plants were which, how to tell when the soil needed more nitrogen, why certain seeds needed cold stratification to germinate. She called me her smart cousin back then, before she learned that smart wasn't the same as valuable in our family's eyes. The conservatory was decorated like something from a fairy tale. Climbing roses wound around white columns, and thousands of tiny lights created a canopy of stars overhead. Round tables draped in cream linen filled the space, each centerpiece a work of art featuring flowers I recognized from my grandmother's collection. White garden roses, blue delphiniums, trailing jasmine. Someone had paid attention to detail, or more likely, paid someone else to pay attention. I stepped inside, my eyes immediately searching for familiar faces. There was Uncle Richard near the bar, his silver hair perfectly styled, deep in conversation with men who looked like they belonged on yacht club membership boards. Aunt Patricia stood with a cluster of women in pearls and careful smiles, her champagne glass held like a scepter. My own parents were nowhere to be seen, which wasn't surprising. They'd moved to Florida after Dad retired, and family gatherings had become optional for them years ago. The cocktail hour was in full swing, waiters gliding between guests with silver trays of hors d'oeuvre and champagne flutes. I accepted a glass of what I assumed was the vineyard's signature Chardonnay and took a sip. The taste was familiar, bright and clean with notes of apple and honey. It should have been familiar. These grapes had grown from vines my grandmother had developed in her makeshift laboratory, crossbreeding varieties with the patience of someone who understood that real innovation takes generations. I found myself gravitating toward the edge of the room, near a display of photographs chronicling Victoria and Marcus's relationship. College sweethearts at Duke, vacation photos from Europe, the proposal on a beach in Santorini. Their life looked like a carefully curated Instagram feed, all sunshine and success and effortless beauty. But as I studied the images, I noticed something interesting. In several of the vineyard photos, you could see the old greenhouse in the background, the one where Grandmother Dot had done her most important work. The one that had been torn down 3 years ago to make room for a parking lot. The dinner bell chimed, a crystal note that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should allow. Guests began moving toward their assigned tables, consulting the seating chart with varying degrees of satisfaction. I approached the elegant calligraphy board, running my finger down the alphabetical list. Harper, Natalie. Table 12. I had to scan twice before I found it, tucked away in the far corner near the kitchen doors, with the plus ones who didn't quite merit prime real estate. Table 12 turned out to be occupied by an interesting collection of wedding afterthoughts. There was Helen Rodriguez, the family accountant who'd worked with my grandmother for 30 years. Beside her sat Tyler Santos, Marcus's college roommate, who'd apparently fallen out of favor with the groomsmen at some point. An elderly woman introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson from the Garden Club, and a young couple who seemed to be there because someone had needed to fill seats. Helen's face lit up when she saw me approaching. "Natalie! My goodness, you look just like Dorothy in that dress. She'd be so proud to see you wearing it." Her voice carried genuine warmth, the kind that reminded me why I'd always liked her. Helen had been one of the few people who'd treated my grandmother with the respect she deserved, who'd understood that the quiet woman in overalls was actually a genius. As we settled into conversation, Helen began sharing stories about my grandmother that I'd never heard. How Dorothy had spent years developing drought-resistant grape varieties that could thrive in North Carolina's unpredictable climate. How she'd shared her research freely with struggling farmers throughout the region, never asking for credit or compensation. How the Agricultural Extension Office still received calls asking for her advice 5 years after her death. The salad course arrived, baby greens that I recognized as a mix my grandmother had developed specifically for this climate. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was eating her work while sitting at the table reserved for people who didn't matter. I picked at the micro herbs, each bite carrying the taste of something that should have been mine by right, if not by law. During the main course, I noticed Aunt Patricia making her rounds to the important tables, air-kissing cheeks, and accepting congratulations on the beautiful event. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her place in the world, who'd never had to prove she belonged anywhere. Her diamonds caught the light with every gesture, and her laugh carried the particular music of someone who'd never known real hardship. It was during the speeches that everything shifted. Marcus stood first, handsome in his navy tuxedo, his words flowing with the ease of someone accustomed to public speaking. He thanked his parents, thanked the Caldwells for welcoming him into the family, thanked the vineyard for providing the perfect backdrop for their love story. Then he raised his glass to toast the legacy of Caldwell wines, built on tradition and innovation spanning 3 generations. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as he spoke about tradition and legacy. The applause that followed felt like static in my ears. 3 generations. As if my grandmother had never existed. As if her work had sprung fully formed from Uncle Richard's imagination. I glanced at Helen, who was staring down at her plate with the expression of someone who'd heard one truth too many rewritten. When Victoria took the microphone, her voice carried the musical quality of someone who'd taken elocution lessons.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She spoke about finding her soulmate, about building a future together, about carrying on the family business that meant so much to everyone gathered here tonight. She thanked her parents for their guidance and support, thanked the team at the vineyard who made everything possible, thanked the land itself for its bounty. Never once did she mention the woman who'd made that bounty possible. I excused myself during the cake cutting, needing air and space to process the growing anger in my chest. The estate grounds were quieter now, most guests having retreated inside for dancing and after-dinner drinks. I found myself walking toward the gardens, following paths lit by carefully placed lanterns. The night air carried the scent of late-blooming flowers, and something else, something that reminded me of my grandmother's greenhouse. I was standing beside a fountain, watching the water catch the moonlight, when I heard footsteps approaching. I turned to see Victoria herself, her dress rustling against the gravel path. For a moment she looked like the girl I'd grown up with, before the years and distance had carved us into strangers. "Natalie," she said, her voice softer than it had been during the speeches. "I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure you would." "Wouldn't have missed it," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Beautiful ceremony. Your parents must be thrilled." Victoria smiled, but something flickered behind her eyes. "They are. Mom's been planning this for months. You know how she gets with events." We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken history settling between us. Finally, Victoria spoke again. "I've been thinking about Grandmother Dot lately, especially being here, surrounded by all this." She gestured toward the vineyard in the distance, where lights twinkled among the vine rows. "Have you?" I asked, surprised by the direction of the conversation. Marcus doesn't really understand the agricultural side of things. He's more focused on the business aspects, the marketing and distribution. But I remember spending those summers at the farm watching her work. She was so patient with us, explaining everything like we were little scientists. For a moment, I felt hope blooming in my chest. Maybe Victoria remembered more than I'd given her credit for. Maybe she understood what had been lost when Grandmother Dot died, and her work had been absorbed into the family business without acknowledgement. "She would have loved this," Victoria continued, looking out over the grounds. "All of us together, celebrating love and family. She always said that was what mattered most." The hope withered as quickly as it had grown. Victoria still didn't understand. She saw my grandmother as a sweet old woman who'd loved her family, not as the brilliant scientist who'd revolutionized sustainable agriculture in the Southeast. She didn't realize that every grape growing on their property, every award-winning vintage, every dollar of profit, could be traced back to Dorothy Whitman's patient work in a converted barn. "She would have been proud of what your family has built," I said carefully, testing the waters. Victoria beamed. "Dad always says she'd be amazed at how far we've come. From her little hobby garden to a real commercial operation. It's like her simple love of growing things inspired something bigger." Hobby garden. Simple love of growing things. I felt my grandmother turning in her grave. Dorothy Whitman had held 3 advanced degrees and had published groundbreaking research in agricultural journals. Her hobby garden had produced crop varieties that were still being studied by universities. Her simple love had been based on decades of rigorous scientific method and innovation. I was about to respond when we heard voices approaching. Aunt Patricia appeared around a bend in the path, followed by Uncle Richard and several guests I didn't recognize. Patricia's eyes landed on me with undisguised irritation. "Victoria, darling, people are asking where you've gone. This is your reception, not a garden party." Her tone carried the particular sharpness she reserved for situations that weren't proceeding according to her plan. "I was just catching up with Natalie," Victoria replied, but I could see her already stepping away from me, drawn back toward the sphere of her mother's approval. Patricia's gaze swept over me, taking in the vintage dress, the simple jewelry, the fact that I was standing apart from the main celebration. "Yes, well, there will be plenty of time for family conversations later. Right now you have important guests waiting." The dismissal was clear, polite, but firm. I was not among the important guests. I was the obligation invite, the distant relation who could be acknowledged briefly and then forgotten. Victoria gave me an apologetic smile as she allowed herself to be led back toward the conservatory, leaving me alone with the fountain and my growing resolve. I remained in the gardens for another few minutes, using the time to center myself and plan my next move. The anger was still there, burning steady in my chest, but it was joined now by something else. Clarity. Purpose. The understanding that this moment had been inevitable since the day my grandmother died, and her life's work had been absorbed into the Caldwell legacy without so much as a footnote. When I returned to the conservatory, the party was in full swing. The lights had been dimmed for dancing, and couples swayed to music played by a jazz ensemble. I made my way back to table 12, where Helen was engaged in animated conversation with Mrs. Patterson about heritage roses. The conversation paused as I sat down, and Helen studied my face with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent decades reading people. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked quietly. "Actually, Helen, I've been meaning to ask you something. You worked with my grandmother for so many years, handled her paperwork and legal affairs. Do you remember her research contracts? The patents and licensing agreements?" Helen's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Some of them, yes. Why do you ask?" "I'm curious about what happened to them after she died. Whether the family inherited them, or if they transferred to someone else." "That's a complicated question, Natalie. Your grandmother was very specific about certain things, very careful about documentation. But families don't always handle these transitions the way the deceased intended." Before I could ask for clarification, the music stopped, and Uncle Richard's voice came over the sound system. He was standing near the band, microphone in hand, his face flushed with champagne and satisfaction. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment. As the father of the bride, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate Victoria and Marcus. But I also wanted to say something about the land that surrounds us, the vineyard that has been the foundation of our family's success." I felt my pulse quicken as he continued. 3 generations ago, my mother-in-law had a small garden where she grew vegetables and a few grapevines. It was nothing fancy, just a woman who loved the soil and had a green thumb. But that humble beginning inspired what you see today. Caldwell Wines has become one of the premier boutique vineyards in North Carolina, and it all started with one woman's simple passion for growing things. The applause was enthusiastic, and I watched as several guests raised their glasses in a toast to the family legacy. Simple passion. Green thumb. Humble beginning. Each phrase felt like a slap, reducing my grandmother's scientific achievements to the level of weekend gardening. "Of course," Uncle Richard continued, his voice warming with paternal pride. "It took vision and business acumen to transform that small garden into what we have today. Victoria and I have worked tirelessly to honor her memory while building something sustainable for future generations." Helen's hand found mine under the table, her fingers squeezing gently. When I looked at her, her eyes were bright with unshed tears and something that might have been anger. The speech concluded with another round of applause, and the dancing resumed. But something had shifted in the room's energy, at least for me. The elegant celebration now felt like a performance built on a foundation of lies, each laugh and toast another nail in the coffin of my grandmother's true legacy. I excused myself from the table and made my way toward the ladies' room, needing a moment to compose myself before I did something irreversible. The bathroom was opulent, all marble and gold fixtures, with the sitting area furnished in pale silk. I stood before the mirror, looking at my reflection in my grandmother's dress. The emerald green fabric seemed to glow under the soft lighting, and for a moment I could see her face superimposed over mine, determined and strong. That's when I heard them. Aunt Patricia's voice, sharp and clear, coming from one of the stalls. "I still can't believe she had the audacity to show up wearing that old dress." As if Dorothy's clothes could make her important somehow. Another woman's voice, one I didn't recognize. "She seems harmless enough. A little awkward, maybe, but harmless. Harmless until she starts asking questions about things that don't concern her." Helen mentioned that she's been poking around in Dorothy's old papers, asking about research and patents. The last thing we need is some misguided sense of entitlement creating problems. My hands gripped the marble counter as I heard the toilet flush and the stall door open. "What kind of problems could she possibly create?" the other woman asked. Patricia's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Dorothy always filled that girl's head with nonsense about being a scientist, about her work being important. Made her think she was special somehow. The truth is, Dorothy was a sweet woman who liked to garden, nothing more. Any legal documents she might have signed were just formalities, ways to make her feel included in the family business." The water ran as Patricia washed her hands, her voice never faltering. "Victoria feels sorry for her, wants to maintain some kind of relationship. But Richard and I know better. Natalie needs to understand her place in this family, which is grateful and quiet. She has no claim to anything we've built, and the sooner she accepts that, the better for everyone. They left without ever knowing I was there, their conversation trailing off as the door closed behind them. I stood alone in the marble bathroom, my grandmother's dress feeling like armor now instead of just fabric. Grateful and quiet. No claim to anything they'd built. I returned to the reception with a smile fixed firmly in place, moving through the crowd with purpose now instead of uncertainty. I danced when asked, made polite conversation with strangers, and played the role of the grateful distant relation who was honored just to be included. But underneath the performance, my mind was working, cataloging details and planning my next moves. The evening wore on, filled with cake cutting and bouquet tossing, and all the traditional markers of wedding celebration. I watched Victoria glide through it all, with the grace of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, never questioned whether she deserved the spotlight. She caught the bouquet toss with a laugh, her eyes finding Marcus across the room with the kind of automatic love that comes from never having to fight for it. As the party began to wind down, guests started making their departures. I lingered longer than I should have, watching the staff begin the subtle work of cleanup, seeing the fairy tale slowly dismantled. When I finally gathered my purse and prepared to leave, I found Victoria near the entrance, saying goodbye to the last of the important guests. "Natalie," she called out, her voice bright with champagne and happiness. "I'm so glad you stayed late. It means so much to me that you were here. It was beautiful, Victoria. Truly. You and Marcus looked perfect together." She hugged me then, a real embrace that reminded me of the summers when we'd been co-conspirators in my grandmother's garden. For a moment, I felt a pang of something that might have been regret for what I was about to do. "I hope we can stay closer from now on," Victoria said as she pulled back. "I know we've grown apart, but family is family, right?" "Family is family," I agreed, the words carrying more weight than she could possibly understand. I drove home to Charlotte in my grandmother's emerald dress, the highway stretching dark and empty before me. My small apartment felt even smaller after the opulence of Biltmore, but it was mine in a way that grand estates and vineyards never could be. I hung the dress carefully in my closet, running my fingers over the silk one last time before closing the door. Then I went to my desk and pulled out the file I'd been building for the past 5 years. Ever since my grandmother's death had made me start asking questions about her life's work. Legal documents, research papers, correspondence with universities and agricultural companies, patent applications filed under the name Dorothy Whitman, with my name listed as the designated heir and successor. My grandmother had been many things, but careless was not one of them. Every innovation, every breakthrough, every grape variety that now grew on Caldwell land had been meticulously documented and legally protected. The family had assumed that a quiet woman in overalls didn't understand intellectual property law. They had been wrong. I opened my laptop and began typing the first of several emails that would go out in the morning. To patent attorneys, to agricultural universities, to the journalists who specialized in family business disputes. The story I had to tell was going to change everything for the Caldwells, and they would never see it coming. Outside my window, Charlotte sparkled with late-night life. People going about their business with no idea that the quiet woman in the small apartment was about to shake the foundations of one of North Carolina's most respected family enterprises. I worked until dawn, building my case with the same methodical patience my grandmother had used to develop her revolutionary grape varieties. By the time the sun rose over the city, I had laid the groundwork for what would become the most expensive wedding gift in the Caldwell family's history. They had made me feel like an afterthought, a charity case grateful for crumbs from their table. Soon they would understand exactly what they had thrown away when they decided I didn't matter. The emerald dress hung in my closet like a promise. Dorothy Whitman's granddaughter was done being grateful and quiet. It was time to be something else entirely. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything seem possible. I sat at my kitchen table in Charlotte, surrounded by 20 years of carefully preserved documents, my laptop humming quietly as I prepared to shatter the illusion that had sustained the Caldwell family for half a decade. The coffee grew cold in my mug as I worked, but I didn't notice. This moment required precision, not comfort. The first email went to Dr. Marcus Fielding at NC State's Department of Horticultural Science. Marcus had been my advisor during graduate school, back when I was still Natalie Harper, the struggling doctoral candidate, not Dr. N. Whitman, whose research papers had quietly revolutionized sustainable viticulture across 3 continents. He'd mentored me through my dissertation on genetic markers in cold hardy grape varieties, never knowing that my theoretical framework was built on decades of practical research conducted by my grandmother in her converted barn laboratory. Marcus, I typed, I hope this finds you well. I'm writing to inform you that I'll be making public my connection to the Dorothy Whitman Botanical Collection, along with documentation of intellectual property violations that have persisted since 2019. I wanted you to hear this from me directly, given our professional relationship and your department's ongoing collaboration with Caldwell Wines. The second email was harder to write. Professor Elena Vasquez at UC Davis had been corresponding with Dr. N. Whitman for 6 years, exchanging research data and co-authoring papers on climate-adaptive agricultural practices. She had no idea that the mysterious Dr. Whitman, who published groundbreaking research from a private laboratory in North Carolina, was actually the granddaughter of the woman whose seed collection had made that research possible. Elena, after careful consideration, I've decided to reveal my true identity and address some long-standing issues regarding the provenance of certain research materials. My legal name is Natalie Harper, and I am the sole heir to Dorothy Whitman's botanical estate, including all associated intellectual property rights. By 10 in the morning, I had sent similar messages to 14 researchers, 5 agricultural companies, and 3 patent attorneys. Each email was carefully crafted, professional but firm, laying the groundwork for what would become a complete restructuring of how the scientific community understood the origins of some of their most valuable agricultural innovations. The responses began arriving within hours. Dr. Fielding called first, his voice tight with concern and something that might have been excitement. Natalie, I've read your email 3 times. Are you telling me that you're Dr. N. Whitman? The Dr. Whitman whose work on disease-resistant rootstock has changed how we think about sustainable vineyard management? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Marcus. And I'm also telling you that every single grape variety currently growing on Caldwell property was developed using my grandmother's research, without proper attribution or compensation. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice carefully controlled. Natalie, if what you're saying is true, this is going to cause a massive shift in how the industry understands intellectual property rights. Do you have documentation? 20 years worth. Patent applications, research notes, correspondence with agricultural extension offices, licensing agreements that were never honored. My grandmother was methodical about protecting her work, even when she was sharing it freely with struggling farmers. That afternoon, I drove to the safety deposit box I'd maintained since graduate school. Inside, carefully preserved in acid-free storage, were the original documents that would prove everything I'd claimed. My grandmother's research journals, written in her precise handwriting, detailing years of hybridization experiments. Patent applications filed under her name, with my name listed as successor. Correspondence with agricultural companies expressing interest in licensing her varieties. Most importantly, there was the will, not the public document that had left her personal effects to the family, but the scientific will she'd filed separately with her attorney, explicitly transferring all botanical research and related intellectual property to me. The Caldwells had never seen this document because they'd never thought to look for it. They'd assumed that Dorothy Whitman, the gardening grandmother, was the complete picture, never imagining that she maintained a separate legal identity as Dorothy Whitman, the research scientist. I photographed every document, uploaded them to secure cloud storage, and made additional physical copies. This wasn't the kind of evidence that could be lost or stolen. Too many careers, too much money, too many reputations hung in the balance. The call from Elena Vasquez came that evening, just as I was preparing dinner. Her accent carried the musical quality of her native Argentina, but her tone was pure business. Natalie, I have been thinking about your message all day. I need to understand something. When you published the paper on phenolic compound stability in hybrid varieties, were you working with original Whitman genetics? Every sample in that study came from vines that my grandmother developed between 1995 and 2003. The Caldwells have been growing them commercially since 2004, but they've never acknowledged the source. Madre mia, do you understand what this means? That paper has been cited in over 200 subsequent studies. Agricultural companies have developed entire product lines based on those findings. If the Caldwells have been commercializing proprietary genetics without proper licensing— She didn't need to finish the sentence. We both understood the implications. This wasn't just about family drama or hurt feelings. This was about millions of dollars in licensing fees, about research ethics, about the foundation of intellectual property law in agricultural science. Tuesday brought a different kind of validation. Dr. James Morrison from the University of Georgia's viticulture program called to tell me that he'd been trying to reach the Caldwells for years, seeking permission to use their grape varieties in climate change research. They always told me that their varieties were proprietary family developments, trade secrets that couldn't be shared. But if you're telling me these are actually Whitman genetics, that changes everything. What do you mean? Dorothy Whitman published her genetic mapping data in the public domain. She wanted her research to benefit the entire agricultural community, not just commercial interests. If these varieties are based on her work, they should be available for non-commercial research purposes. I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. My grandmother's vision had been larger than profit, broader than family loyalty. She'd wanted her work to help solve problems, to contribute to human knowledge, to make farming more sustainable and resilient. The Caldwells had turned that vision into a private money-making enterprise, hiding the source of their success behind claims of proprietary development. Wednesday brought the first legal correspondence. Patricia Caldwell's attorney, a man named Bradford Hayes, whom I remembered from family gatherings as someone who specialized in making problems disappear quietly, sent a formal letter demanding that I cease making false and defamatory statements about the family business. The letter was exactly what I'd expected, full of legal language designed to intimidate rather than address the actual issues I'd raised. Hayes threatened lawsuits for slander, demanded that I retract my statements to researchers, and suggested that I was suffering from misunderstandings about the nature of agricultural development that could be resolved through appropriate family counseling. I read the letter twice, then forwarded it to every patent attorney on my contact list, with a brief note. This is the level of legal sophistication we're dealing with. I think you'll find their position interesting. The responses were swift and uniformly amused. Agricultural intellectual property law was a specialized field, and Bradford Hayes had just revealed that he didn't understand the basics. You can't claim proprietary rights to genetic material that was developed by someone else and placed in the public research domain. You can't threaten defamation suits over factual statements about patent ownership. And you definitely can't resolve intellectual property disputes through family counseling. By Thursday, the story had taken on a life of its own. Word travels fast in academic circles, especially when it involves research that many scientists had been using as the foundation for their own work. The American Society for Enology and Viticulture issued a statement expressing concern about irregularities in the attribution of certain widely cited genetic materials. And 3 major agricultural journals announced that they were reviewing papers that had cited Caldwell wines as the source of research materials. That's when Victoria called. Her voice was different from the happy bride I'd spoken with 4 days earlier. Gone was the musical confidence, replaced by something tighter and more fragile. Natalie, we need to talk. There are people saying things, making accusations. Mother is beside herself. What kind of accusations, Victoria? You know what kind. About Grandmother Dot's research, about our grape varieties. People are questioning whether we have the right to grow our own vines, whether our wines are legitimate. It's insane. I kept my voice level, professional. It's not insane if the questions are based on documented evidence. What evidence? Grandmother had a garden, Natalie. She grew vegetables and a few experimental grapes. That doesn't make her some kind of scientist. The disconnect was stunning. Victoria had grown up spending summers at the farm, had seen the greenhouse laboratory, had watched Dorothy work with genetic samples and chemical analysis equipment. But somehow, the family narrative had rewritten all of that into a garden and a few experimental grapes. Victoria, did you ever wonder why your grandmother's greenhouse had a microscope? Why she kept detailed notes about genetic crosses and soil chemistry? Why universities called her for advice about agricultural problems? Silence. Then, quietly, I thought she just liked to keep track of things. She kept track of things because she was conducting original research that revolutionized sustainable viticulture in the Southeast. Research that your family has been commercializing for 20 years without giving her credit or paying licensing fees. That's impossible. If what you're saying were true, we would have known. There would have been paperwork, legal documents. There were legal documents. Your parents chose not to tell you about them. The conversation ended badly, with Victoria hanging up after accusing me of jealousy and attention-seeking. But her call had confirmed something important. The younger generation of Caldwells genuinely didn't know the truth about their family's success. They'd been raised on a sanitized version of history that portrayed their grandfather as a visionary businessman who'd built an empire from scratch, with Dorothy Whitman relegated to the role of supportive grandmother who'd contributed moral encouragement and maybe a few gardening tips. Friday brought the first media attention. A journalist named Sarah Chen from Agricultural Business Weekly had gotten wind of the story and was asking pointed questions about patent ownership and licensing agreements. Her voicemail was professional but persistent. Ms. Harper, I'm working on a story about intellectual property disputes in family agricultural businesses. I understand you've raised some concerns about the Caldwell Wines operation. I'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss your claims and review any documentation you might have. I called her back that afternoon, after taking time to prepare my talking points. Sarah turned out to be exactly the kind of journalist I'd hoped for, knowledgeable about agricultural science, familiar with intellectual property law, and unimpressed by family wealth or social connections. Ms. Harper, I've been covering agricultural business for 8 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. The scope of the alleged patent violations is extraordinary. Are you saying that an entire vineyard operation has been built on misappropriated genetic material? I'm saying that my grandmother developed grape varieties that are now worth millions of dollars in annual revenue, and she never received a cent in licensing fees. More than that, the family has actively obscured her contributions, presenting her work as their own innovations. Have you attempted to resolve this privately with the family? For 5 years, I've tried to have conversations about properly crediting my grandmother's work. Those conversations were dismissed as family sentiment, misunderstandings about how agricultural development works. It wasn't until I threatened legal action that they began to take the issue seriously. Sarah's article would run the following Monday, but she gave me a preview of her findings. She'd spoken with researchers at 4 universities who confirmed that they'd been working with Caldwell Genetics under the assumption that the varieties were proprietary family developments. She'd reviewed patent filings that clearly listed Dorothy Whitman as the original developer. Most damaging, she discovered that several agricultural companies had been paying licensing fees to the Caldwells for varieties that should have been freely available for research purposes. That weekend, I drove to Hendersonville for the first time since my grandmother's funeral. The old farm looked smaller than I remembered, but the bones of her research operation were still visible if you knew what to look for. The main greenhouse had been torn down, but the foundation remained, along with the irrigation system she designed to test how different grape varieties responded to controlled water stress. I walked through what had once been her experimental plots, now overgrown with weeds and volunteer plants. But even in the neglect, I could see the structure of her work. Rows laid out to test different spacing patterns. Soil composition changes designed to evaluate nutrition requirements. Root training systems that had later been adopted by commercial vineyards throughout the region. Standing there in the late afternoon light, I could almost see her moving through the rows, notebook in hand, recording observations with the patience of someone who understood that real innovation required years of careful attention to detail. She'd worked alone most of the time, funded by small grants and her own savings, driven by curiosity and the belief that agriculture could be both profitable and sustainable. The Caldwells had taken her life's work and turned it into exactly the kind of commercial operation she'd spent years trying to improve. They'd focused on profit margins and market share, ignoring the environmental considerations that had been central to her research. They'd replaced her diverse experimental plots with monoculture production, prioritizing efficiency over the biodiversity that had made her varieties so resilient. As I drove back to Charlotte that evening, I thought about what my grandmother would want me to do with the power I now held. She'd never been vindictive, never sought recognition for its own sake. But she'd also never tolerated dishonesty or the exploitation of other people's work. She'd spent her career fighting for farmers who couldn't afford expensive inputs or sophisticated equipment, developing varieties that could thrive with minimal intervention. The Caldwells had perverted that vision, using her innovations to build an elite operation that served wealthy consumers, rather than addressing the real challenges facing agricultural communities. They'd hidden the democratizing potential of her work behind claims of proprietary development, denying other researchers the ability to build on her foundations. Monday morning brought Sarah Chen's article, published both online and in the print edition of Agricultural Business Weekly. The headline read, "Family Vineyard Built on Grandmother's Hidden Research Empire," and the story laid out the facts with devastating clarity. Patent numbers, licensing violations, documented correspondence between Dorothy Whitman and agricultural researchers dating back 15 years. The article included quotes from Dr. Fielding, Dr. Vasquez, and 3 other researchers who confirmed that they'd been working with Whitman genetics without knowing it. It detailed the potential financial implications, noting that proper licensing fees for the varieties in question could total several $1 million annually. Most importantly, it explained the scientific significance of Dorothy's work, positioning her as a pioneering researcher whose contributions had been systematically erased from the historical record. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone began ringing before I'd finished reading the article, with calls from journalists, researchers, and lawyers wanting to discuss the implications. The Caldwell Wines website crashed under the weight of media attention. Agricultural forums exploded with discussions about intellectual property ethics and family business transparency. But the call that mattered most came from Helen Rodriguez. "Natalie," she said, her voice heavy with something that sounded like relief. "I've been waiting 20 years for someone to tell this story. Your grandmother made me promise to keep her research confidential while she was alive, to let her control how it was shared. But she also made me promise to protect your interests if anything happened to her." "What do you mean?" "I have copies of everything. Every research note, every patent application, every piece of correspondence." Dorothy knew that her work was valuable, and she was terrified that it would be lost or misappropriated after her death. She set up a separate trust, completely outside the family's knowledge, with instructions that you should inherit all botanical research materials and associated intellectual property rights. The trust documents Helen sent that afternoon changed everything. Not only did I own the rights to my grandmother's existing varieties, but I held legal ownership of her research methodologies, her genetic mapping data, and her experimental breeding lines. The Caldwells hadn't just been violating patent law, they'd been operating their entire business on property that legally belonged to me. More than that, the trust included detailed instructions for how Dorothy wanted her work to continue. She'd established a research foundation, funded by licensing fees from her innovations, dedicated to developing agricultural solutions for small farmers and climate-stressed communities. The foundation had been dormant since her death, waiting for me to claim my inheritance and activate the legal structures she'd put in place. That evening, I called Bradford Hayes, Patricia Caldwell's attorney. His secretary tried to screen the call, but I was persistent. "Mr. Hayes, this is Natalie Harper. I believe you sent me a letter last week threatening legal action if I continued to discuss my grandmother's research." "Ms. Harper, yes. I trust you've given serious consideration to the potential consequences of your recent statements." "I have. And I've decided that you're absolutely right about the need for legal action. That's why I'm calling to inform you that I'll be filing suit tomorrow morning for patent infringement, breach of licensing agreements, and fraudulent appropriation of intellectual property. The damages we're seeking total approximately $12 million, plus injunctive relief that would prevent Caldwell Wines from using any Whitman genetics until proper licensing arrangements are established." The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Hayes spoke, his voice considerably less confident than it had been in his letter. "Ms. Harper, perhaps there's been some misunderstanding. I'm sure we can resolve any concerns through family negotiation." The time for family negotiation ended when your clients threatened me with legal action for telling the truth about my own inheritance. "I'll see you in court, Mr. Hayes." I hung up and immediately called the patent attorney who'd been handling the preliminary legal research. Within an hour, we'd scheduled a meeting for the following morning to finalize the lawsuit that would either force the Caldwells to acknowledge the truth about their business or shut down their operation entirely. That night, I sat in my grandmother's emerald dress one more time, not because I was going anywhere special, but because I wanted to feel connected to her strength as I prepared for the battle ahead. The fabric still carried the faint scent of her perfume, something floral and earthy that reminded me of the greenhouse where she'd spent so many quiet hours changing the future of American agriculture. Outside my window, Charlotte sparkled with its usual energy, people going about their lives unaware that tomorrow would bring a reckoning 20 years in the making. I thought about Victoria, probably sleeping peacefully in her new married life, still believing that her family's success was built on legitimate business acumen. I thought about Patricia and Richard, likely awake and panicking as they tried to figure out how much I really knew and what I might do with that knowledge. Most of all, I thought about my grandmother, working alone in her converted barn, driven by the conviction that science could make the world better if it was pursued with integrity and shared with generosity. She'd never lived to see her work receive proper recognition, never benefited financially from innovations that had generated millions in revenue for others. But she'd left me the tools to finish what she'd started. Not just the legal documents and research materials, but the understanding that real power comes from truth, that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that sometimes the quiet person in the corner is the one you should fear most. Tomorrow, the Caldwells would learn what Dorothy Whitman's granddaughter was truly capable of, when she stopped being grateful and quiet, and started being something else entirely. The courthouse steps in downtown Asheville felt different beneath my feet this time. 3 weeks had passed since Victoria's wedding, but the memory of walking through those Biltmore gardens in my grandmother's emerald dress felt like a lifetime ago. Now I wore charcoal gray, professional and sharp, the kind of outfit that spoke in courtrooms and boardrooms rather than whispered in conservatories. My attorney, Janet Morrison, met me at the security checkpoint. She was everything Bradford Hayes wasn't: precise, knowledgeable about agricultural law, and completely unimpressed by old family money. Her reputation in intellectual property disputes was legendary, earned through 2 decades of holding corporations accountable for exactly the kind of systematic appropriation the Caldwells had committed. "They requested an emergency hearing," Janet said as we made our way through the marble corridors. "Judge Martinez agreed to see us this morning, which tells me they're more rattled than they're letting on." Hayes filed a counter motion claiming harassment and seeking a restraining order to prevent you from contacting their business partners. On what grounds? Tortious interference with business relationships. It's a desperate move, really. They're trying to frame your communications with researchers as malicious sabotage rather than disclosure of legitimate intellectual property claims. We entered courtroom 3B to find the Caldwell delegation already assembled. Patricia sat in the front row, her posture rigid with the kind of controlled fury that wealthy people deploy when their carefully constructed worlds begin to crumble. Richard was beside her, looking older than he had at the wedding, his silver hair less perfectly styled. Victoria was notably absent, which didn't surprise me. This wasn't the kind of family business they'd want the new bride to witness. Bradford Hayes approached our table with what I assumed was meant to be a conciliatory smile. His confidence seemed forced, like an actor who'd forgotten his lines but was still trying to stay in character. "Ms. Harper, I'm hoping we can resolve this misunderstanding before it escalates unnecessarily. Perhaps we could step outside and discuss some kind of accommodation that would satisfy everyone's interests." Janet's response was crisp and dismissive. "Mr. Hayes, my client has made her position clear. The Caldwell family has been operating a commercial agricultural enterprise using proprietary genetic material for which they hold no valid licensing agreements. We're seeking full damages and injunctive relief. If your clients wish to negotiate, they can do so through proper channels after acknowledging the validity of our claims." Judge Martinez entered the courtroom with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd seen every possible variation of family business disputes. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with intelligent eyes that suggested she wouldn't tolerate theatrical grandstanding from either side. "I've reviewed the preliminary filings in this matter," she began, settling behind the bench with a stack of documents. "Mr. Hayes, you're seeking emergency injunctive relief to prevent Ms. Harper from contacting third parties regarding alleged intellectual property violations. Ms. Morrison, your client is claiming systematic patent infringement and seeking substantial damages. This appears to be a complex dispute that belongs in civil litigation, not emergency proceedings. Can someone explain why we're here today?" Hayes stood first, his voice carrying the theatrical cadence of someone who'd learned law from television dramas. "Your Honor, Ms. Harper has embarked on a malicious campaign to destroy a respected family business through false and defamatory statements. She's contacted researchers, journalists, and commercial partners with baseless claims about patent ownership, causing substantial damage to my client's reputation and business relationships." "Mr. Hayes," Judge Martinez interrupted, "are you claiming that Ms. Harper's statements about patent ownership are factually incorrect?" "I'm claiming that they're taken out of context, misrepresented, and being used to cause harm rather than resolve any legitimate legal issues." Janet stood, her demeanor calm and factual. "Your Honor, my client holds documented intellectual property rights to agricultural innovations that have been commercially exploited by the defendants for over 15 years. We have patent filings, research documentation, and witness testimony establishing clear ownership. Ms. Harper's communications with third parties have been factual disclosures of legal rights, not defamatory statements." Judge Martinez leaned forward, her attention sharpening. "Ms. Morrison, do you have documentation of these patent rights with you today?" "I do, Your Honor." Janet opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "These are certified copies of patent applications filed by Dorothy Whitman between 1998 and 2004. Covering 7 grape varieties currently in commercial production at Caldwell Wines. Ms. Harper is listed as the designated successor on all patents, and we have the probate documentation showing that these rights transferred to her upon Ms. Whitman's death." The judge accepted the documents and began reviewing them, her expression growing more serious as she read. The courtroom fell silent except for the whisper of turning pages and the soft scratch of her pen making notes. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Martinez looked up. "Mr. Hayes, I'm looking at what appears to be legitimate patent documentation. Do your clients hold competing patents for these same genetic materials?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, the agricultural development process is complex. My clients have invested substantial resources in developing and refining these varieties over many years." "That's not what I asked. Do your clients hold patents for the genetic materials in question?" "The family has maintained these varieties through traditional agricultural methods, improving and adapting them over generations of cultivation." Judge Martinez set the documents down with a firmness that suggested her patience was wearing thin. "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to ask you one more time for a direct answer. Do your clients hold patents for the grape varieties they're currently growing?" The silence stretched until it became painful. Finally, Hayes spoke, his voice noticeably quieter. "No, Your Honor. The varieties were developed by Dorothy Whitman, who was Richard Caldwell's mother-in-law." "And did Ms. Whitman assign her patent rights to your clients?" Another pause. "The family understood that her work was intended to benefit the family enterprise." "Understanding and legal assignment are 2 different things, Mr. Hayes." "Ms. Morrison, do you have documentation showing transfer of patent rights from Dorothy Whitman to the Caldwell family?" Janet stood again. "No, Your Honor. In fact, we have documentation showing that Ms. Whitman explicitly retained all intellectual property rights and designated Ms. Harper as her sole successor for botanical research assets." Judge Martinez nodded, making additional notes. Then she did something that made my heart race. She looked directly at me. "Ms. Harper, you're claiming that your family has been commercially exploiting your inherited intellectual property without permission or compensation for 15 years? I stood, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Yes, Your Honor. My grandmother developed these varieties as part of her independent research program. The family incorporated them into their commercial operation after her death, without acknowledging her contributions or seeking licensing agreements. And you've attempted to resolve this privately? For 5 years, I've tried to have conversations about properly crediting my grandmother's work and establishing appropriate licensing arrangements. Those attempts were dismissed or ignored until I began asserting my legal rights publicly. Judge Martinez turned back to Hayes. Mr. Hayes, your motion for emergency relief is denied. Based on the documentation presented today, Ms. Harper appears to have legitimate intellectual property claims that should be addressed through proper civil litigation. Your client's remedy is to file appropriate responses to her claims, not to seek prior restraint on her communications about her legal rights. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed to echo through my entire body. Hayes immediately requested a sidebar conference, but Judge Martinez was already gathering her papers. The court will schedule a case management conference within 30 days to establish discovery timelines and trial scheduling. In the meantime, I'm issuing a temporary injunction preventing Caldwell Wines from expanding their cultivation of the disputed varieties until this matter is resolved. As the judge left the courtroom, I felt something shift in the air around our table. The Caldwell delegation was huddled in urgent conversation, Patricia's voice carrying an edge of panic even though I couldn't make out her words. Richard kept glancing over at me with an expression that mixed anger with something that might have been fear. Hayes approached our table one more time, his earlier confidence completely abandoned. Ms. Morrison, my clients are prepared to discuss reasonable accommodation. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to explore mutually beneficial solutions. Janet's smile was sharp and professional. Mr. Hayes, my client is prepared to consider licensing agreements that provide fair compensation for past use and ongoing royalties for future commercial exploitation. We'll expect full financial disclosure of revenues generated by the disputed varieties as part of any settlement discussions. As we left the courthouse, I felt the weight of 20 years lifting from my shoulders. The morning sun seemed brighter, the mountain air cleaner. For the first time since my grandmother's death, someone in authority had listened to the truth and recognized it as such. But the real test was waiting for me in the parking garage. Victoria stood beside my car, still beautiful but somehow diminished. Her wedding glow had been replaced by something harder to define, an uncertainty that seemed to have settled into the bones of her face. She was alone, which surprised me. I'd expected Patricia to orchestrate this encounter, to use Victoria's relationship with me as leverage in whatever negotiation they were planning. "Natalie," she said as I approached, her voice carrying none of its usual musical confidence. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." "Not here. Can we go somewhere private, please?" I agreed to meet her at a small coffee shop in downtown Asheville, a place neither of us had history with. We drove separately, and I used the 10-minute journey to prepare myself for whatever manipulation or emotional appeal was coming. The Caldwells were smart enough to know that direct legal confrontation wasn't working, which meant they'd move to their backup strategy: family sentiment and personal relationships. The coffee shop was nearly empty, just a few college students with laptops and an elderly man reading a newspaper. Victoria ordered something complicated, with multiple flavor modifications, a nervous habit from childhood that I remembered from family gatherings. I kept it simple. Black coffee, no sugar, no room for distraction. We sat by the window, afternoon light casting patterns across the small wooden table between us. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Victoria stared into her drink as if it held answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "I've been thinking about what you said," she finally began. "About Grandmother Dot being a scientist, about her work being important. I keep trying to remember the details from those summers at the farm, but everything feels different now." "What feels different?" "The way she worked. I always thought she was just puttering around, enjoying her garden. But you're right about the equipment, the careful notes, the way she talked to those university people who called. I was too young to understand what I was seeing. I waited, sensing there was more. Mother sat me down yesterday and explained the family's position. She said you were confused about how agricultural development works, that you'd misunderstood some legal documents. She said Grandmother Dot's gardening hobby had inspired the vineyard, but that all the real work, the commercial development, had been done by our family. Do you believe that? Victoria looked up from her drink, meeting my eyes for the first time since we'd sat down. I want to believe it. It would be so much easier if I could believe it, but I keep remembering things that don't fit with that story. What kind of things? The way she talked about genetics and soil chemistry, the microscope in the greenhouse, the filing cabinets full of research papers, the correspondence with agricultural companies. She wasn't just keeping gardening notes, was she? I shook my head. She was conducting original research that revolutionized how we think about sustainable viticulture. She developed genetic markers for disease resistance, created varieties that could thrive in challenging climates, published papers that influenced agricultural policy across 3 states. And our family has been taking credit for her work. Your family has been profiting from her work while actively obscuring her contributions. There's a difference between inspiration and appropriation, Victoria. She was quiet for a long time, processing implications that I could see reshaping her understanding of her own life. Finally, she spoke again, her voice smaller than before. What happens now? To the vineyard? To the business? To our family? That depends on whether your parents are willing to acknowledge the truth and make things right, or whether they want to continue fighting a battle they can't win. Mother says you want to destroy us, that you've always been jealous of our success. Your mother is projecting her own motivations onto me. I don't want to destroy anything. I want my grandmother's work to be recognized and properly compensated. I want the research foundation she established to be activated, so her innovations can benefit the broader agricultural community the way she intended. Victoria leaned back in her chair, looking suddenly older. There's something else. Mother told me about a trust fund. Money that was supposed to be set aside for education and research. She said it was used for vineyard improvements because the family needed the capital. This was new information, and it hit me like a physical blow. What trust fund? Something Grandmother Dot established, supposedly for scholarships and agricultural research grants. Mother said it wasn't legally binding, that it was more like a wish list than an actual financial obligation. I felt my grandmother's presence in that moment, her quiet voice explaining her vision for how agricultural innovation should serve communities rather than enriching individuals. She'd not only left me intellectual property rights, she'd tried to establish a funding mechanism to ensure that future research would continue her mission of democratizing agricultural innovation. Victoria, I need you to find out everything you can about that trust fund. What happened to the money? When it was redirected? Who made those decisions? This isn't just about patent violations anymore. Her face went pale. You think they stole money that was supposed to go to education? I think your parents have been systematically dismantling every aspect of your grandmother's legacy while building their own wealth on her innovations. The question is whether you're going to help them continue doing it, or whether you're going to help me restore what she really wanted. Victoria left the coffee shop looking like someone who'd just discovered that her entire life story was fiction. I felt sorry for her in a way I hadn't expected. She'd been raised on lies, told that her family's success was the result of hard work and business acumen, rather than the systematic exploitation of a brilliant woman's research. Learning the truth meant confronting the possibility that everything she'd been proud of was built on fraud. But sympathy couldn't change the facts or alter my determination to see justice done. That evening, I called Janet Morrison to discuss the new information about the Educational Trust. Her response was immediate and sharp. Natalie, if they diverted trust funds that were legally designated for educational purposes, we're not just talking about patent infringement anymore. We're talking about breach of fiduciary duty, possibly criminal misappropriation of charitable assets. How do we prove it? We subpoena their financial records going back to your grandmother's death. We trace every dollar that was supposed to go to the trust and see where it actually went. If they use that money for personal or business expenses, they're in serious legal trouble. The implications were staggering. What had started as a dispute over intellectual property rights was becoming a comprehensive audit of 20 years of financial misconduct. The Caldwells weren't just thieves. They were systematic fraudsters who'd built their empire by stealing both ideas and money from a woman who'd trusted them to honor her wishes. 2 days later, the first major domino fell. Agricultural Business Weekly published a follow-up article detailing the educational trust that had been diverted to fund vineyard expansion. Sarah Chen had done her homework, tracking down records from the community college where my grandmother had wanted to establish agricultural scholarships, interviewing farmers who'd been promised access to research grants that had never materialized. The article included a devastating quote from Dr. Fielding at NC State. Dorothy Whitman's vision was to create an educational pipeline that would bring innovative agricultural techniques to small farmers and underserved communities. If that funding was redirected to support a luxury vineyard operation, it represents a betrayal of everything she stood for. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Local news stations picked up the story. Agricultural advocacy groups issued statements condemning the misuse of educational funds. Most importantly, the state attorney general's office announced that they were opening an investigation into potential charity fraud. That's when Patricia called me directly. Her voice was different from anything I'd heard from her before. Gone was the imperious confidence, replaced by something that sounded almost like desperation. "Natalie, we need to meet. Face to face, without lawyers, without publicity. Just family." "Why would I want to do that, Patricia?" "Because this situation has gotten out of hand, and I think you and I both want to protect Victoria from the consequences of decisions that were made before she was old enough to understand them." It was a masterful manipulation, invoking concern for Victoria, while implying that I was somehow responsible for putting her in harm's way. But it was also an admission that Patricia recognized her position was becoming untenable. "Where do you want to meet?" "The farm. Tomorrow evening, just the two of us. I think it's time you understood the complete picture of what your grandmother wanted and what really happened after she died." I agreed to the meeting, but not out of sentiment or curiosity. I wanted to hear what Patricia's final gambit would be, what lies she'd constructed to justify 20 years of systematic theft. And I wanted to see her face when I made it clear that no amount of family manipulation would stop me from reclaiming everything that had been stolen from my grandmother's legacy. The drive to Hendersonville felt like traveling backward through time. Each familiar landmark carried memories of summers spent learning at my grandmother's side, watching her work with the patient precision of someone who understood that real innovation couldn't be rushed. As I turned into the long driveway leading to the old farm, I could see Patricia's Mercedes already parked near the main house. She was waiting on the front porch, dressed in what I assumed was her version of casual clothes, but which still managed to look expensive and carefully coordinated. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, and for a moment she looked like a figure from a photograph, preserved in amber while the world changed around her. "Thank you for coming," she said as I approached, her tone carrying a formality that made it clear this wasn't going to be a warm family reunion. We went inside, to the living room where I'd spent countless evenings listening to my grandmother tell stories about her research, her hopes for the future of sustainable agriculture, her dreams of using her innovations to help farming communities adapt to climate change. Patricia settled into the same chair where my grandmother used to sit, a detail that felt like deliberate psychological warfare. She'd brought a folder with her, thick with documents that she placed carefully on the coffee table between us. "I want to show you something," she began, opening the folder to reveal what looked like financial records. "Your grandmother's situation was more complicated than you realize. When she died, the farm was heavily mortgaged, her research equipment was outdated and expensive to maintain, and the educational trust she'd established was underfunded and legally problematic." I listened without interrupting, curious to see where this revisionist history was headed. "Richard and I didn't steal anything, Natalie. We saved a failing operation and transformed it into something successful. We honored Dorothy's memory by building on her work, expanding it into something that could actually generate the resources needed to support agricultural innovation. By taking credit for her research and hiding her contributions? By focusing on practical results rather than academic recognition. Dorothy was brilliant, but she wasn't a businesswoman. She would have died in debt if we hadn't taken over the commercial aspects of her work. Patricia opened another section of the folder, revealing what appeared to be loan documents and equipment receipts. The numbers were substantial, suggesting that the transition from research farm to commercial vineyard had required significant capital investment. "What about the educational trust?" I asked. "It was never properly funded. Dorothy had grand plans, but she didn't have the financial resources to make them reality." The small amount that was designated for educational purposes was redirected into equipment upgrades and infrastructure improvements that benefited the entire agricultural community. It was a sophisticated lie, built around enough financial complexity to create doubt about the underlying facts. Patricia was betting that I'd be overwhelmed by the documentation, that I'd accept her version of events rather than dig deeper into the actual legal and financial records. But she'd miscalculated. I'd spent 5 years preparing for exactly this conversation. "Patricia," I said, pulling out my own folder, "I have the original trust documents. I have correspondence between my grandmother and the educational institutions she wanted to support. I have bank records showing exactly how much money was designated for scholarships and research grants. And I have documentation showing where that money actually went." Her composure cracked slightly, just enough for me to see the calculation behind her eyes as she recalibrated her approach. "Even if that's true," she said, "the statute of limitations has expired on most of these issues. You can't unwind 20 years of business decisions based on technicalities and family sentiment." "Actually, I can. Ongoing patent infringement resets the statute of limitations with each commercial use of the protected intellectual property. Charitable trust violations have different limitation periods, especially when fraud is involved. And intellectual property theft is essentially a continuing offense that extends the time limits considerably." The sun had set while we talked, and the room was now lit only by a single lamp. Patricia looked smaller in the dim light, less commanding than she had at Victoria's wedding. The careful facade of wealthy confidence was beginning to crack, revealing something more desperate underneath. "What do you want, Natalie? Money? Recognition? Some kind of public apology? Tell me what it would take to resolve this quietly." "I want my grandmother's research foundation activated with the funding she intended. I want proper academic credit given for her innovations. I want licensing agreements that provide fair compensation for ongoing commercial use of her varieties. And I want assurance that future research will be conducted according to her original vision of benefiting agricultural communities rather than enriching individuals." "That's impossible. The costs would bankrupt the vineyard operation." "Then maybe the vineyard operation deserves to be bankrupt. Maybe building wealth on stolen innovations while hiding the source of your success was always going to catch up with you eventually." Patricia stood abruptly, her composure finally dissolving into something rawer and more honest. "You're going to destroy an entire family business out of spite. You're going to ruin Victoria's future, eliminate jobs for dozens of employees, wipe out 20 years of investment and growth, all because you can't accept that life isn't fair. I'm going to restore what was stolen and ensure that my grandmother's work serves the purposes she intended. If that destroys your business, it's because your business was built on a foundation of lies." She left without another word, her expensive car disappearing into the darkness beyond the farm's gates. I remained in the living room for another hour, sitting in my grandmother's chair, surrounded by the silence that had once been filled with her plans for changing the world through patient scientific innovation. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Not just the legal battles and financial negotiations, but the task of rebuilding what had been systematically dismantled over 2 decades. My grandmother's research foundation would rise from the ashes of family greed, funded by the profits that had been generated from her stolen work. The Caldwells had made their choice 20 years ago, when they decided that Dorothy Whitman's legacy was something they could appropriate and rebrand. Now they would discover that her granddaughter had inherited more than just intellectual property rights. She'd inherited the patient determination to see justice done, no matter how long it took or what family relationships had to be sacrificed in the process. The quiet woman in overalls was finally going to get the recognition she deserved, delivered by the granddaughter they'd never bothered to take seriously until it was too late. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after my confrontation with Patricia at the farm. It came from an address I didn't recognize, but the subject line made my blood run cold. Family emergency, please call immediately. The sender was listed as Dr. William Hendricks, Emergency Department, Mission Hospital. My hands shook as I opened the message. Victoria had been admitted following what the medical staff described as a severe anxiety attack. She'd collapsed at the vineyard during a meeting with investors, hyperventilating and unable to speak coherently. The attending physician had found my contact information in her emergency contacts and was requesting immediate family notification. I drove to Asheville faster than I should have, my mind racing through possibilities. Had the stress of learning the truth about her family's business finally overwhelmed her? Was this genuine medical crisis, or another manipulation orchestrated by Patricia to gain sympathy and leverage? By the time I reached the hospital, I'd prepared myself for either scenario. Victoria looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, diminished by the hospital gown and the maze of monitoring equipment surrounding her bed. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face was pale without makeup. When she saw me enter the room, her eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't breathe," she whispered, her voice hoarse from whatever had happened at the vineyard. I was sitting in that conference room, listening to Mother explain our expansion plans to potential investors, and suddenly I couldn't get enough air. Everything felt like a lie, like I was suffocating on 20 years of stories that weren't true. I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her bed, noting that she was alone. No parents, no husband, no other family members maintaining their vigil in the sterile hospital room. "Where's Marcus?" "Business trip to California. He doesn't know I'm here. Mother told him I had food poisoning and just needed rest." Victoria laughed bitterly. Even now, she's managing the narrative, controlling what people know and when they know it. "And your parents?" "They were here earlier. Mother spent an hour explaining to the doctors that I've been under tremendous stress due to malicious family litigation. She made it sound like you were personally responsible for my breakdown, like your legal actions had pushed me past my breaking point." The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Patricia had found a way to weaponize her own daughter's mental health crisis, turning Victoria's genuine distress into ammunition for their legal defense. "What really happened, Victoria?" She closed her eyes, leaning back against the hospital pillows. "I've been going through Grandmother Dot's papers, the ones stored in the attic at the main house. Mother told me they were just personal effects, family photographs, and sentimental items. But I found boxes of research correspondence, legal documents, financial records." "What kind of financial records?" "Bank statements showing deposits from agricultural companies, licensing agreements for research materials, contracts with universities for collaborative studies. Natalie, our entire family business is built on her work, and we've been pretending she was just a hobbyist gardener who inspired our success." Victoria opened her eyes, looking directly at me with an expression that mixed shame and determination. "I found the original trust documentation. The educational fund was supposed to receive 30% of all revenue generated by her genetic innovations. Do you know how much money that represents over 20 years? I waited for her to continue, sensing that she needed to say these words out loud to make them real. Over $4 million. $4 million that was supposed to fund scholarships and agricultural research, redirected into vineyard expansion and family expenses. We bought our house with money that was meant to help farming students pay for college. We funded our European vacations with grants that should have gone to small farmers implementing sustainable practices. The hospital room fell silent, except for the soft beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of medical activity in the corridor. Victoria's revelation confirmed what I'd suspected, but hadn't been able to prove. The Caldwells hadn't just stolen intellectual property, they'd systematically looted a charitable trust for personal enrichment. "There's more," Victoria continued, her voice barely audible. "I found correspondence between Mother and a lawyer discussing strategies for keeping you away from family business. They knew about your rights to Grandmother Dot's research. They've known for years, and they've been actively working to prevent you from discovering the truth. This was new information, potentially crucial for the legal case. If Patricia and Richard had knowingly violated my intellectual property rights while taking active steps to conceal their actions, it elevated their behavior from negligent appropriation to intentional fraud. Victoria, I need those documents." I photocopied everything before I came to the investor meeting. They're in my car, locked in the trunk. I was planning to call you after the meeting. But when I sat in that conference room listening to Mother present our 5-year expansion plan, built entirely on stolen innovations funded by stolen money, I just couldn't handle the pretense anymore. A nurse appeared in the doorway, checking Victoria's chart and monitoring her vital signs with professional efficiency. After she left, Victoria struggled to sit up straighter in bed. I have to make this right, Natalie. I can't be part of this anymore. Whatever legal consequences there are for my family, for the business, for my own financial security, I have to tell the truth about what we've done. Your parents aren't going to make this easy for you. I know. Mother's already started preparing damage control. She's telling people that you manipulated me, that you took advantage of my emotional state to turn me against my own family. She's going to present my cooperation with your legal case as evidence of mental instability rather than moral awakening. The cynicism was staggering but not surprising. Patricia had demonstrated repeatedly that she would sacrifice anyone, including her own daughter, to protect the fraudulent empire she'd built on my grandmother's stolen work. What about Marcus? Does he know about any of this? Victoria's expression grew more complicated. Marcus knows that our family business involves agricultural innovation, but he's never been interested in the technical details. His focus has always been on the marketing and distribution aspects. I don't think he's ever asked where our grape varieties originally came from. But he's benefited financially from the fraud. We both have. Our entire lifestyle, our social position, our financial security. It's all built on money that was stolen from educational programs and research initiatives. Even if I cooperate with your legal case, even if I help expose the truth, I'm still complicit in 20 years of systematic theft. The weight of that realization seemed to press Victoria deeper into the hospital bed. She was confronting not just the collapse of her family's business, but the destruction of her own identity as someone who'd earned her privileged position through legitimate means. Victoria, cooperation with the legal process doesn't erase past harm, but it can prevent future damage. The longer this fraud continues, the more money gets diverted from the educational programs your grandmother wanted to support. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I keep thinking about those summers at the farm, watching her work in the greenhouse. She was so patient with us, so excited to share her knowledge. She wanted her research to help people, to make farming more sustainable and accessible. We turned that vision into a luxury brand that serves wealthy consumers while hiding the source of our innovations. The door opened again, and this time it wasn't a nurse. Patricia swept into the room with the controlled urgency of someone who'd been managing crisis situations her entire adult life. She took in the scene quickly. Victoria's tears, my presence beside the bed, the obvious intimacy of our conversation. "Natalie," she said, her tone carefully modulated to suggest concern rather than hostility. "I appreciate you coming to check on Victoria, but I think she needs rest rather than additional stress right now." "Actually, Mother, I asked Natalie to come. We were having an important conversation about Grandmother Dot's research in the family business." Patricia's composure cracked slightly, revealing the calculation behind her maternal concern. "Victoria, darling, you're not in any condition to be making important decisions right now. The doctor said you need to avoid stressful topics until your anxiety stabilizes. The anxiety is caused by living with lies, Mother. Learning the truth about what we've done is actually helping me feel calmer and more grounded." "What we've done?" "Victoria, we've built a successful business that honors your grandmother's memory while providing employment for dozens of people and contributing to the local economy. There's nothing to feel guilty about." I watched this exchange with fascination, seeing Patricia's manipulation techniques deployed with surgical precision against her own daughter. Every sentence was designed to reframe Victoria's moral awakening as psychological instability, to make her question her own perceptions rather than confront uncomfortable truths. But Victoria had moved past the point where those techniques could be effective. "Mother, I found the trust documents. I found the correspondence with lawyers about keeping Natalie away from family business. I found bank records showing how educational funds were redirected into personal and business expenses. I know what we've done, and I can't pretend otherwise anymore." Patricia's mask slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating underneath the maternal concern. Victoria, you don't understand the complexities of business operations or legal structures. Those documents need to be interpreted by professionals who understand corporate finance and intellectual property law. I understand theft, Mother. I understand fraud. I understand that we've been stealing money from educational programs while taking credit for innovations we didn't develop. The hospital room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as Patricia processed the implications of Victoria's statement. Her daughter wasn't just having an emotional breakdown. She was preparing to testify against the family business in legal proceedings that could result in criminal charges. Natalie, Patricia said, turning to me with undisguised hostility. I don't know what manipulation tactics you've used to confuse Victoria, but exploiting someone's medical crisis to advance your legal case is unconscionable. I didn't manipulate anyone, Patricia. Victoria contacted me because she wanted to discuss what she'd discovered in your family's records. She's making her own decisions based on evidence she found herself. Evidence that was stored in private family files, obtained without permission during a period of documented mental instability. Any court would recognize that Victoria's current statements are the product of psychological distress rather than rational decision-making. It was a sophisticated legal strategy, designed to neutralize Victoria's potential testimony by framing her cooperation as evidence of mental incompetence. Patricia was betting that she could convince a court that her daughter's moral awakening was actually a psychological breakdown, making her an unreliable witness whose statements should be disregarded. But she'd made a crucial mistake. She was deploying this strategy in front of Victoria herself, allowing her daughter to see exactly how far Patricia was willing to go to protect the fraudulent business they'd built. Mother, Victoria said quietly, are you seriously planning to argue in court that I'm mentally incompetent because I want to tell the truth about what our family has done? I'm planning to protect you from making decisions you'll regret for the rest of your life. This legal dispute will be resolved through negotiation and settlement, like all complex business matters. Your emotional involvement is only complicating the process. My emotional involvement? Mother, these aren't just business matters. This is about stealing from educational programs. This is about taking credit for innovations developed by someone else. This is about lying to investors, researchers, and customers about the source of our success. Patricia's frustration was becoming more visible as her attempts to control the conversation failed. Victoria was no longer responding to the psychological techniques that had worked for 25 years. And Patricia didn't seem to have backup strategies for dealing with a daughter who refused to be manipulated. Victoria, I'm going to ask Natalie to leave so we can have a private family discussion about these issues. No, Mother. Natalie is family too, and she has more right than anyone to be part of discussions about Grandmother Dot's legacy. If anyone should leave, it's you. The silence that followed was profound and charged with decades of suppressed conflict. Patricia had built her identity around controlling family narratives and managing other people's perceptions. Being rejected by her own daughter, in favor of the family member she'd spent years marginalizing, represented a complete collapse of her carefully constructed authority. When Patricia spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, harder and more overtly threatening than her usual sophisticated manipulation. Victoria, if you choose to cooperate with Natalie's legal case against the family business, you need to understand the consequences. Your inheritance, your financial security, your social position, your marriage, everything you've built your life around will be destroyed. Is your relationship with Natalie worth sacrificing your entire future? Mother, my entire future is built on stolen money and stolen ideas. If telling the truth destroys that future, then it wasn't worth having in the first place. Patricia left without another word, her expensive shoes clicking sharply against the hospital corridor as she retreated to plan whatever desperate strategy would come next. Victoria and I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. She's going to make this as difficult as possible, Victoria finally said. She'll use every legal strategy, every personal connection, every manipulation technique she can think of to prevent me from testifying truthfully about what I've discovered. Can you handle that kind of pressure? I don't know. But I know I can't handle continuing to live with lies. The anxiety attack wasn't really about stress from your legal case. It was about the realization that my entire adult life has been built on fraud, and I've been complicit in that fraud even when I didn't understand what was happening. Victoria was discharged from the hospital that evening with instructions to follow up with her primary care physician and consider counseling for anxiety management. I drove her home, noting how empty and lifeless the expensive house seemed without the foundation of legitimate success to support its grandeur. The photocopied documents she'd mentioned were indeed in her car trunk, organized in neat folders that revealed the methodical nature of her investigation. As we spread the papers across her dining room table, the full scope of the Caldwell fraud became undeniably clear. There were licensing agreements that should have generated hundreds of thousands in annual revenue for the Educational Trust. Bank records showing systematic transfer of charitable funds into personal and business accounts. Correspondence with lawyers discussing strategies for concealing intellectual property violations. Most damning, there were internal family memos acknowledging that the grape varieties were Dorothy Whitman's innovations while planning public relations campaigns that would present them as Caldwell family developments. Victoria, this documentation is going to change everything. Not just the civil lawsuit, but potentially criminal charges for charity fraud and intellectual property theft. I know. And I'm prepared to testify about what I found, what I know about family business operations, and what I've learned about how educational funds were diverted. Your mother wasn't exaggerating about the consequences. If you cooperate fully with the legal case, you could lose everything you've built your financial life around. Victoria looked around her expensive dining room, with its crystal chandelier and antique furniture, all purchased with money that should have gone to agricultural students and sustainable farming research. Natalie, I can't keep living in a house bought with stolen educational funds. I can't keep wearing jewelry purchased with money meant for farming scholarships. I can't keep pretending that I've earned any of this through legitimate means. What about Marcus? What about your marriage? Marcus married someone he thought came from a family of successful agricultural innovators. When he learns that we're actually sophisticated thieves who've been stealing from educational programs for 20 years, he'll have to decide whether he can accept being married to someone complicit in that kind of fraud. The weight of Victoria's decision was enormous. She was choosing to sacrifice her financial security, her social position, and potentially her marriage in order to rectify 20 years of systematic fraud. It was the kind of moral courage that would have made my grandmother proud, even as it destroyed the empire that had been built on her stolen innovations. We worked until midnight, organizing documents and preparing a comprehensive timeline of the financial fraud. Victoria's insider knowledge of family business operations provided crucial context for understanding how the theft had been systematized and concealed over 2 decades. As I prepared to leave, Victoria walked me to the door with an expression of determined calm that reminded me of my grandmother's quiet strength. Natalie, I want you to know that I'm not doing this just to assuage my guilty conscience. I'm doing it because Grandmother Dot deserved better, and because her vision of agricultural innovation serving educational and community purposes is more important than my family's wealth. It's going to be a difficult process. Your parents will do everything they can to discredit your testimony and frame your cooperation as betrayal of family loyalty. Let them try. I've spent my entire adult life being loyal to lies. It's time to be loyal to the truth, whatever the personal cost. I drove home through the dark mountain roads, thinking about the courage it had taken for Victoria to confront the foundation of her own privilege and choose justice over comfort. My grandmother would have been proud of her granddaughter-in-law's moral awakening, even as she would have been heartbroken by the systematic destruction of her life's work that had made such awakening necessary. The legal case would proceed with new evidence and cooperative testimony that would make the Caldwells' position virtually indefensible. But more than legal victory, Victoria's decision represented the possibility of genuine restoration. The educational programs my grandmother had envisioned could finally be established, funded by recovered assets and ongoing licensing fees. The quiet woman in overalls would finally see her vision realized, delivered by the courage of a young woman who chose truth over comfort, justice over loyalty, and my grandmother's legacy over her own family's fraudulent success. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Patricia and Richard escalated their desperate defense strategies. But tonight, for the first time since my grandmother's death, I felt confident that her work would ultimately serve the purposes she'd intended, no matter what personal costs had to be paid along the way. 6 months after Victoria's hospitalization, I stood in the main conference room, of what had once been Caldwell Wine's headquarters, now temporarily serving as the offices for the Dorothy Whitman Agricultural Research Foundation. The irony wasn't lost on me that the building purchased with stolen educational funds would now house the legitimate research programs my grandmother had always envisioned. The settlement negotiations had concluded 3 weeks earlier, with an agreement that exceeded even my attorney's most optimistic projections. The Caldwell family would transfer ownership of all disputed intellectual property, pay $8 million in damages and licensing fees, and provide an additional $12 million to fully capitalize the educational trust. Most importantly, they would publicly acknowledge Dorothy Whitman as the original developer of the grape varieties that had made their fortune possible. Victoria sat across from me at the polished conference table, reviewing the final paperwork for the foundation's establishment. Her transformation over the past 6 months had been remarkable. Gone was the perfectly styled socialite I'd known at her wedding, replaced by someone more substantial and purposeful. She'd cut her hair shorter, traded designer clothes for practical work attire, and developed the focused intensity of someone who'd discovered meaningful work for the first time in her life. The first scholarship recipients have been selected, she reported, consulting the tablet where she kept meticulous records of the foundation's activities. 25 students from farming families across North Carolina will receive full tuition support for agricultural science programs. The research grants are more complicated, but we should have the first awards announced by spring. Her voice carried none of the musical superficiality I remembered from family gatherings. Adversity had stripped away the performative aspects of her personality, revealing someone with genuine intelligence and determination underneath the social conditioning. What about the community outreach programs? Dr. Rodriguez from the Agricultural Extension Office is coordinating field demonstrations of sustainable farming techniques. We're starting with 3 counties, focusing on small farms that can't afford expensive consulting services. The goal is to prove that Grandmother Dot's innovations can improve yields and soil health even for operations with limited resources. The foundation was becoming exactly what my grandmother had envisioned, a practical resource for agricultural communities rather than a source of private profit. The research facilities were being redesigned to support collaborative projects rather than proprietary development. The educational programs prioritized students from farming backgrounds who might not otherwise have access to advanced agricultural training. Helen Rodriguez knocked on the conference room door, carrying a stack of legal documents that required final signatures. At 73, she'd chosen to come out of retirement to serve as the foundation's executive director, bringing decades of experience managing agricultural nonprofits and an intimate understanding of my grandmother's vision. The final asset transfers are complete, Helen announced, settling into a chair beside Victoria. The vineyard property has been sold, with proceeds designated for the Educational Trust, as specified in the settlement agreement. The equipment and facilities have been donated to the State Agricultural College, where they'll support student research projects. The dismantling of the Caldwell wine empire had been swift once the legal framework was established. Without access to my grandmother's genetics and facing massive financial obligations, Patricia and Richard had chosen liquidation over prolonged litigation. The prestigious vineyard that had generated millions in annual revenue was now student housing and research plots. What about Patricia and Richard? I asked. Have they completed their community service requirements? Victoria's expression tightened slightly. The criminal charges for charity fraud had been resolved through plea agreements that included substantial financial penalties and mandatory community service with agricultural nonprofits. Patricia was currently working with a food bank in Charlotte, while Richard was assisting with farm equipment maintenance for a cooperative of small producers. Mother calls it the most humiliating experience of her adult life, Victoria said quietly, but I think it's the most honest work she's done in 20 years. Yesterday she called to tell me about a family she'd helped register for food assistance, and for the first time in months, she sounded like she was talking about something that actually mattered. The criminal proceedings had been more devastating to the family's social position than the financial losses. The revelation that respected community leaders had been systematically stealing from educational programs had destroyed their reputation among the wealthy circles where they'd once been influential. Country club memberships were terminated, charitable board positions were revoked, and social invitations simply stopped arriving. But Victoria had found something more valuable than social status in the wreckage of her family's empire. She'd discovered the satisfaction of work that served purposes larger than personal enrichment, and she developed relationships based on shared values rather than shared wealth. "How's Marcus handling the transition?" I asked. Victoria's smile was complicated, but genuine. "Better than I expected, actually. The financial losses were difficult for him initially, but he started working with sustainable agriculture consultants, helping conventional farms transition to environmentally responsible practices. He says it's more intellectually challenging than marketing luxury wines to wealthy consumers." Their marriage had survived the collapse of their previous lifestyle, strengthened by the discovery that they both found more meaning in productive work than in conspicuous consumption. They'd sold their expensive house and moved to a modest farm outside Charlotte, where Marcus was developing organic growing techniques while Victoria managed the foundation's operations. The afternoon brought the event I'd been anticipating since the settlement was finalized: the public dedication of the Dorothy Whitman Agricultural Research Center. The ceremony was being held at NC State, in the renovated greenhouse complex, where my grandmother's work would finally receive the institutional support she'd always deserved. The gathering was smaller than the grand social events the Caldwells had once hosted, but infinitely more meaningful. Agricultural researchers from across the Southeast mingled with farming families, graduate students, and community advocates. Dr. Fielding gave a presentation detailing my grandmother's contributions to sustainable viticulture, while Dr. Vasquez participated virtually from California to discuss international applications of the research methods Dorothy had pioneered. But the moment that mattered most came when Dr. Morrison from the University of Georgia took the podium to announce the establishment of the Dorothy Whitman Fellowship Program. The fellowships would provide full funding for graduate students researching climate-adaptive agriculture, with preference given to applicants from farming backgrounds who intended to return to agricultural communities after completing their education. Dorothy Whitman understood that real agricultural innovation happens when scientific research serves the needs of actual farmers. Dr. Morrison explained to the assembled crowd, "These fellowships will ensure that her approach to collaborative, community-focused research continues to influence how we think about sustainable food production for decades to come." Standing at the back of the auditorium, I felt my grandmother's presence more strongly than I had since her death. She would have been overwhelmed by the recognition but deeply satisfied by the practical applications. The research center bearing her name would function exactly as she'd always intended, as a resource for farming communities rather than a source of private profit. After the ceremony, I walked through the renovated greenhouse facilities with Victoria and Helen. The equipment was state-of-the-art, funded by the settlement money that had been recovered from 20 years of systematic theft. Graduate students were already working with genetic samples from my grandmother's collection, developing new varieties designed to help small farms adapt to changing climate conditions. "She would have loved this," Victoria said, watching a doctoral student carefully cross-pollinate experimental grape varieties. The collaboration between researchers and farmers, the focus on practical applications, the commitment to making innovations freely available rather than hoarding them for commercial advantage. "She would have been proud of you," I replied. It took courage to choose truth over family loyalty, justice over comfort. Not many people would have made that choice when it meant sacrificing everything they'd built their identity around. Victoria was quiet for a moment, considering the weight of what she'd given up and what she'd gained in return. "Natalie, I spent 25 years being proud of things I hadn't earned, living on money that belonged to educational programs, taking credit for innovations my family had stolen. The life I lost wasn't worth keeping if it was built on lies." As we prepared to leave the research center, Helen handed me a thick envelope containing the quarterly report on the Foundation's activities. The document detailed scholarship recipients, research grants awarded, and community programs established with the recovered assets. Every dollar was being spent according to my grandmother's original vision, supporting agricultural education and innovation for the benefit of farming communities. But more than the financial restoration, the foundation represented something my grandmother had valued even more highly: the acknowledgement that her work mattered, that her contributions to agricultural science deserved recognition, and that her vision of collaborative research serving community needs was not just sentimental idealism, but practical wisdom. The drive home to Charlotte took me through rural counties where some of the Foundation's first community programs were being implemented. I stopped at a small farm near Concord, where the owner, Mrs. Patterson, was testing drought-resistant grape varieties developed from my grandmother's genetic lines. The vines looked healthy, despite the challenging growing conditions, their leaves a deeper green than the conventional varieties in neighboring plots. "Your grandmother's work is going to save my farm," Mrs. Patterson told me as we walked through the experimental rows. "These varieties use 30% less water than what I was growing before, and they're showing better resistance to the fungal problems that have been devastating my neighbors' crops." This was the impact my grandmother had always intended. Practical solutions that helped individual farmers survive and thrive, rather than abstract research that benefited only academic careers or corporate profits. The foundation was already demonstrating that her approach to agricultural innovation could work on a larger scale, providing resources and support for farming communities throughout the region. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the quarterly report and planning the foundation's expansion into other states. The work was challenging and consuming, requiring expertise in nonprofit management, agricultural science, and community organizing. But it was also deeply satisfying in ways that my previous career had never been. My phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "Board meeting confirmed for next week. Dr. Chen from Clemson wants to discuss collaborative research on climate adaptation. Also, Marcus found a farm in Georgia that's interested in participating in the Sustainable Transition Program." The foundation was growing beyond what any of us had initially envisioned, attracting interest from researchers and farmers across the Southeast. The practical applications of my grandmother's work were proving even more valuable than the theoretical contributions that had made her reputation in academic circles. As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at me was different from the woman who'd attended Victoria's wedding 8 months earlier. The uncertainty and quiet desperation had been replaced by something more confident and purposeful. I'd found my own work, my own mission, my own way of honoring the legacy that had been entrusted to my care. The emerald dress still hung in my closet, carefully preserved as both a memory and a symbol. I thought about wearing it to the next foundation gala, not as armor against family rejection, but as a celebration of the work that connected my grandmother's vision to contemporary agricultural challenges. But tonight, I was content to simply know that Dorothy Whitman's research was finally serving the purposes she'd intended, that her innovations were helping farming families rather than enriching corporate interests, and that her vision of collaborative, community-focused agricultural science was becoming reality through institutions that bore her name and reflected her values. The quiet woman in overalls had achieved something more lasting than personal recognition or financial reward. She'd created knowledge that could improve lives, developed innovations that could help communities adapt to environmental challenges, and established principles that would guide agricultural research for generations to come. The Caldwells had stolen 20 years of proper credit and financial benefit, but they'd been unable to destroy the fundamental value of her work or prevent it from ultimately serving the purposes she'd envisioned. Justice had taken longer than it should have, cost more than it needed to, and required sacrifices that shouldn't have been necessary. But justice had prevailed, delivered by the patient accumulation of evidence, the courage of family members who chose truth over comfort, and the determination of a granddaughter who'd inherited more than genetic material and intellectual property rights. She'd inherited the responsibility to see that good work served good purposes, that innovation benefited communities rather than individuals, and that brilliant people receive the recognition they deserve, even if that recognition comes posthumously. The Dorothy Whitman Agricultural Research Foundation would continue growing, expanding into new regions and new applications of sustainable farming techniques. The scholarship programs would help hundreds of students access agricultural education they couldn't otherwise afford. The community outreach initiatives would bring cutting-edge research to farmers who needed practical solutions to immediate challenges. Most importantly, my grandmother's name would be permanently associated with the collaborative, community-focused approach to agricultural innovation that she'd pioneered. Future researchers would understand that real progress comes from serving farming communities rather than corporate interests, that sustainable agriculture requires both scientific rigor and practical wisdom, and that the best innovations are those shared freely rather than hoarded for private profit. I fell asleep thinking about the students who would benefit from Dorothy Whitman fellowships. the farmers who would implement techniques developed in Dorothy Whitman research centers, and the communities that would be strengthened by agricultural innovations designed to serve public rather than private interests. The wedding, where I'd been dismissed as an unimportant afterthought, had become the catalyst for the most meaningful work of my life. The family that had tried to erase my grandmother's contributions had been forced to acknowledge them publicly and permanently. The wealth that had been built on stolen innovations was now funding the educational programs she'd always envisioned. Sometimes justice moves slowly, arrives quietly, and looks different from the dramatic vindication we imagine. But sometimes it's more satisfying precisely because it transforms theft into service, converts private greed into public benefit, and ensures that brilliant work ultimately serves the purposes its creator intended. The quiet woman in overalls would have been proud of what her granddaughter had accomplished in her name. Not just the legal victories or financial recoveries, but the transformation of personal injustice into institutional change that would benefit agricultural communities for decades to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.